Okay, so we're going to start out by creating a new project in Unity. To start up a game, we obviously need to decide where our game is going to be saved. I have that already set up in our location here. We need to give the game itself a title, or the project file a title, which we'll just call it tennis, keep it nice and simple. And we need to make sure that we make it a 2D game, because this isn't a 3D game that we're working within. Although you could still just as well use 3D objects within our 2D project, we're just setting it up in 2D by default because we know that we're going to be working as a 2D game. And it's more straightforward, and basically it just sets up Unity with a bunch of defaults for our project. So now that we have those settings all set up, all we have to do is hit create project, and it'll start setting up our game and opening up Unity for us. So once Unity is all loaded, we'll see ourselves here in the default view. And now we can actually start on our project. So before we start the project, I'm going to give a quick little overview of the basic layout of what we see here in Unity. So if you're already familiar with the layout of Unity, you can skip on to the next video. But for those who haven't encountered Unity before, we've got a basic kind of screen set up here, divided up into windows, and we'll just go through what each window is. So starting off down here, we have the project folder. So the project folder will be where we store all our assets in the game. So say for example here, we start off by default in the assets folder, so we can create extra folders here. We can create folders, scripts, materials, sprites, a variety of different things, and basically this is where all our objects will be organized within the game. So we'll see here beside the project we have console. Console is basically any messages that Unity gives to us. So if there's any errors or anything like that, they'll appear here in the console, and if we have any problems with whatever scripts we're writing, they'll appear here in the console, and we'll know how to fix them then. Or at least we'll know that we have an error and to look at them and how we can fix them. So those are our basic. So some of our basics down here. Up here on the left we have our hierarchy, and this will be any objects that are currently in use within our active game. So the way we can see what's active in the game is what's in our scene view here. So this is our main kind of view that we use to interact with the world and what we're doing within it. So if I was to, for example, in here, if I were to go up to the top and go to game object and create a new cube here, so it'll pop a cube into the world, and you'll see over here in our hierarchy on the left, we now have a cube listed down here, and we also have the main camera just as an object within the world, and as something that can see things within our world. So we can see here our main camera is represented by this object here, and then we have our cube represented obviously as a cube here, although because we've set our project up in 2D, it only appears as a 2D square. Now, if we wanted to switch to having our scene view actually be in 3D, we can hit this 2D button up here, which you can see is already highlighted, so that means it's already active. So we can click on that and it will go to a 3D kind of cube view, but we're not really messing around with that for the moment. We're going to go back to 2D. We're keeping it nice and simple and sticking with the 2D components of Unity. Now, if we wanted to manipulate these objects within the world, we have a bunch of little buttons up here that allow us to do that. And we'll go through them from left to right. So we have this little hand symbol, and there's a shortcut to activate that. So we can just hit Q on that if we want to, like that, and it would activate. Our hand symbol just allows us to move around within the scene view. Another way to do that is say for example I was on a different object, if I just right click, I can click and drag around the scene view like that. So that's what our hand tool does. Then we have this directional tool, which is for moving objects around the world. So if I have that selected and I have my cube selected, we can click and drag that around within the world like that. We can then look at the next object, which is our rotate tool. So our rotate rotates around 3 different axes, which are the X, Y, and Z axis. Although because we're in 2D, we can only at the moment see X and Y. So if I was to grab this green line here, I can rotate that object around like that. If I was to grab the red line, I can move it and rotate it like that. And you can see when we rotate, we can now see the Z-axis line. So if I were to grab that and rotate it, now we can see our object is it's looking more like a 3D object, even though we're in a 2D view. I'll just reset this back. So that's our rotate tool. Then beside that we have the scale tool. So our scale tool can be used to, if we click on the white square in the middle, you can make our object bigger in all dimensions, or we can click and drag it in just one axis, or click and drag it up and down like that. So we can adjust the size of our object to whatever kind of size we want it to be. And finally we have the last button on the array of little buttons that we have here, which allows us to freely kind of manipulate whatever our object is. So it kind of works with it's similar to our scale tool. We can click and drag it around, but we can manipulate by its corners. We can also click on it and drag it around within the world. So it's a very handy tool to be able to use in that way. So that's the basics of how we manipulate our tool, our objects within the world. So this is basically everything we'll want to do with our scene view. We can then look here. We have this game tab. So if we switch over to that, this is what our game will currently look like when it's running. So when we're on the game view, we can't interact with anything here at all. This is just replicating what we can see with it when the game is running. So if I switch back to our scene view, if I was to move the cube over here, we can see it's moved in our game view. If I just zoom out, if you use the scroll wheel on your mouse, it'll zoom in and out of our scene view here. So if we were to grab the camera now and switch over to our move tool, and we can move that around, you'll get a preview of what the game view will actually show. So if we're looking in the bottom right corner here, we get this camera preview, and that directly reflects, if we switch over to the game view, exactly what is seen within our game view. So we can see if we move the camera, say up here, now our box is down in the bottom left. So as I said, the most important thing to remember is in our game view that we can't actually interact with that in any way as we're editing our game. And if we switch back to our scene view here, when we hit the play button up here, so the play button will make our system run as if the game itself is actually running. So if I hit play, it can sometimes take a couple of seconds to activate. And then we see when these buttons go blue here, that means that our game is now active. And it switches automatically over to the game view. So whatever game we have running, obviously it'll be a bit more active than just having a box on the screen. But if we switch back to scene view, while the game is running, we can make any changes we want here. But there's one important thing to remember, and that is that any changes you make while the game is running won't be applied when the game is then stopped. So say for example, I'm going to move this cube here. I'm going to move it down to the bottom left. So in our game view, now our cube is down in the bottom left there. But if we stop the game running by pressing the play button again, when we switch back to the scene, we can see our cube goes back to where it originally was when we started running the game. So it's important to remember that any changes you make while your game is running won't be applied when you stop the game running that time. It's just one of those little things that it's important to remember, but you'll likely incur it and you'll forget it as you go. It's just one of those things you'll pick up more and more as you do things within the game. So just before we move on any further, I'm going to hit the play button again here. We see we have these two different buttons here. All that they do is pause the game. So if we had any motion going on here, we would see that the game would be paused. I'm actually just going to very quickly give this cube some gravity. I'm just going to give it, you don't need to worry too much about what we're doing here for the moment, but just as an example, I'm going to hit play and we'll see our cube fall like that. So if I hit the pause button before we hit play, what will happen is it'll just pause our game in action. So when we hit play, it doesn't automatically, because we paused it, it doesn't automatically switch over to our game view. So if I now unpause it, we'll see it fall. I can pause again. And then finally we have our third button here, which is just makes it move on by one frame. So we can see it just moves on to the next logical bit of movement that happens. And those are our three buttons up here in action. So finally, we have over here on the right the inspector view. And the inspector view shows us details about whatever object we have activated within our game. So I'm just going to switch back over to our scene view. So on our cube, for example, here in our inspector, the first thing we have is transform. And transform dictates where everything is within the game. So when we move our object around, you can see our position in the transform changes. When we rotate it, you can see that our rotation changes depending on which axis we move, like that. And then when we scale it, you can see our scale here gets moved up and down depending on what we do. So transform is one of the most basic elements that you'll see in the inspector, and you'll see it for every object that exists within our game. So if I was to change the camera, you'll see the camera also has a transform component as part of it in the inspector. It's something that any object within Unity will have a transform, because we'll need to know where any object can be within the world at any particular time. So because this is a cube also, it has a cube mesh applied to it. It has a box collider because it needs to be a physical object, so it has a box applied to it. It has a mesh render so that we can see it, and then I give it a rigid body which makes it have some gravity. Again, you don't need to worry about any of these components just yet. They're just things that exist. But just as another example, when you switch over to our camera, then it still has the transform component applied to it, but it also has the default camera script applied, and has a couple of other default things down here as well. So that's the only differences between them, but it's just important to note that when you want to see any kind of information about any object within Unity, you look over here at the inspector. Those are the basic kind of elements of our windows here. There's nothing else really to them. So the next thing we're going to do is look at making our actual project that we're going to work on next all set up nicely.